The first sound is a splintering, not of wood, but of lineages. You arrive in the middle of it. An ember caught in the ribs of an old house, a child's lullaby, answered by something that does not belong to the cradle. Bone remembers before the face remembers. There are cemeteries where the stones lean as if whispering to one another, where dates fold back on themselves and names repeat until they become incantations. In such places the mapmakers stop drawing roads. They call them hollows, or bends in the mountain, where the sun forgets to touch the ground, where the wind carries the odor of old wool and older secrets. This is where the story begins. Not at the first name on a ledger, but at the moment the ledger stops making sense. They called her Magdalene in the ledgers, though her name was older than the script used to write it. The first time her name was set to paper, the ink shook as if the pen feared the syllables. She was not a woman born of ambition. She arrived in the hollow wrapped in the same thin, unremarkable cloth every child wore. And yet every eye that followed her carried the quiet of something waiting to be revealed. She learned the topography of the hollow like she learned a language. The low places where water collects and the high places where foxes slept. She learned which houses kept their doors bolted and which kept their stories open like many lipped graves. There are families who marry their cousins because the world beyond is a rumor. There are families who mark a birth not with joy, but with pragmatic ledger entries, as if noting a supply of flour. In the hollow, generations fold inward until the family tree becomes a knot. That knot hums. Magdalene was born into such a knot, and the knot did not feel like bad luck to her. It felt like destiny sharpening to a point. She moved through the world with a kind of patient hunger that is not visible until it has already done its work. By the time the ledger entries begin to thicken around her name, Magdalene is a keeper of certain household rites, not church rites, not wholesome things that make a parson smile, but quiet observances that the old women taught each other in kitchens where the light was always long past sunset. Ashes from the stove became offerings. Names were said 3 times, and then once more under the breath. These were not the crimes of a single night. They were habits, ritualized and steady, like a clock that keeps time by counting sorrow. And in that counting the hollow learned to look away. They learned to fold their hands and pretend the slow things did not happen. They learned, most of all, to believe that what lived within their borders could be contained by silence. But silence is porous. It lets in a different kind of air. It gathers in corners like dust. And sometimes, in such hollows, the quiet develops its own gravity. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The question sits like a coin on an old table, small and oddly intimate, a way to measure distance between one pulse and another. The hollow had its own measure of time, not the clock hands of the outside world, but the slow swing of seasons and the quicker swing of rumor. People marked nights by which houses kept their lamps burning and which wrapped themselves in blankets of shame. When a family's story changed, the hollow took note with the same steady, dispassionate attention it gave to births and harvests. There were watches too, but not of silver. Watchfulness that belonged to neighbors who had seen too many winters and so had fewer illusions left. Magdalene's house stood near the creek that ran like a vein through the hollow, and the creek kept secrets the way old women keep recipes, passing them salt, soaked and folded into cloth. Children threw stones into that water and listened for the ripple it made, and the ripple sometimes answered with a shape. The house smelled of dried herbs and the iron tang of preserved meat. A swing hung from a branch in the yard, and it creaked at night though no child swung upon it. The records, those brittle, curled leaves kept in the courthouse and in the soft bindings of family Bibles, begin to thicken at this house. They are not neat. Marginalia crawls like fungus. Dates blur, names double back. The ledger is a map of how human decisions calcify into pattern. When the ledgers are cross-referenced, the lines tangle, and the tangle is often described clinically as genetic concentration or closed population, as if language could make invisible things visible. But paper is a thin skin on a deeper wound. Underneath the facts and figures there exist behaviors, and under those behaviors, a temperament. Magdalene had a temperament like vaulting. There was an idea inside her that kept asking to be tested. At first the hollowness is only a whisper. A woman who keeps to herself, a family that refuses to take in outsiders, a refusal to bury certain objects or to allow strangers to catalogue their births. Then comes the pattern of peculiar births. Faces with angles not common in the region, voices that carry old echoes. Children who learn the names of the dead as easily as they learn to walk. People speak of these things in the way they speak of storms, reverent, hushed, and with certain inevitable fatalism. They are spoken of less as aberrations and more as the hollow's own weather. Magdalene became a figure of such weather. Not a villain in the daytime's clear light, but an inevitability. Someone how the hollow's strange climate produced. She kept hours like a bell. She moved through public spaces with the ease of someone who expects to be obeyed, and with the patience of someone who would wait decades to test a theory. Her life was stitched with small, domestic cruelties and larger, ecstatic experiments. She recorded names in books no one else read, drew charts with lines that looped and folded like intestines, and spoke of lineage as if it were a kind of alchemy, a matter to be refined, distilled, and made pure. Maps of the region show only roads that lead outward, but the hollow's map is different. It records where people go when they never go again. The town that appears on government maps is a blip. On local maps, there are shaded areas, orchards, marshes, fields, and a ring of houses that act as both boundary and witness. Near the ring sits Magdalene's house, its foundation sunken, as if listening to something below. The mountain around them kept its own calendar. It hung on to frost long after the plains had turned mild. That slow, patient freeze teaches people certain habits, the preservation of food, the preservation of stories. People hide things in root cellars and in the folds of family memory. They hide their shame with the same diligence. When the archive hunters arrived decades later, they found whole volumes of entries that made little sense to modern taxonomies. The handwriting was quick and urgent. There were diagrams that looked like family trees until one noticed the lines doubling back and crossing. There were names repeated as if to assert a presence where none should exist. These were not the neater sense of respectable lineages. They were the knotted rope of a family that had pulled inward, time after time, believing inwardness would save them from a world they did not know how to survive. Into this braided story a child arrives, or rather, a child is born from the hollow slow practice, and the arrival of the child is not marked by joy in the ledger. The midwife, an old woman whose hands had delivered half the families in the hollow, wrote in the margins of her own short journal, a small one, oddly still eyes like the winter creek. That small, oddly still infant would be named Isabel by neighbors who had to give her something other than catalog numbers to call her by. Isabel did not cry like other babies. Her first sounds were small clicks and what the old women called counting, like someone reciting numbers under their breath. As she grew, Isabel's body took on certain traits that the Hollow had seen before and that they had learned to dread. Her limbs moved with a subtle stiffness. Her face seemed drawn by an old hand. She stared too long at the places where the light bent and listened as if some distant voice spoke through the floorboards. The children watched her with an unsettling curiosity. She was not cruel. She was not particularly fond of others. She did not play games in the ways the others did. Instead, she collected small things: a rusted button, a tooth, a moth's wing. Each of these items she catalogued in a small box beneath her bed, and when the lid closed, the box seemed to exhale a cold breath. Parents muttered that the blood had grown thin in the Hollow, that the years of choosing among the same set of names had loosened the weave of humanity. But others said it was not about blood at all. They pointed to Magdalene and to the midnight ceremonies in which songs were sung that were not for the living. Isabel learned those songs. They rubbed against her like river stones as she slept. She woke speaking archaic syllables and walking the paths between houses at dawn. The Hollow tolerated many eccentricities. It did not tolerate the sense that some house had become a doorway. Isabel's presence was a small, constant push against the edges of the Hollow's shared sanity. She was the slow, persistent pressure of frost under a cellar door, the kind of pressure that, given enough time, will lift the planks away. And Magdalene watched this pressure with a devotion that had the patience of a slowly sharpened knife. The Hollow kept its festivals small. They celebrated the harvest with potlucks, and the winter with small bonfires, and the rest of the year with things that were mostly ceremonies of endurance. But by the time Isabel reached an age to stand beside a field and pass a scythe, the nights had begun to change. People heard things that were not animals. Dogs would not go certain paths. Children woke with the taste of iron in their mouths. The old women spoke of patterns, and patterns hardened into fear. Magdalene's rights had always been private, or so the Hollow assumed. They were the kinds of acts explained away with proverbs. Old women keep their own counsel, yet rituals are like bones, once visible. They hold the shape of what the body once was. From beneath Magdalene's floorboards, the Hollow's watchful ears began to register rhythms. Not the ordinary creaks of an old house, but a cadence arranged like a songbook. The sounds threaded through the night air, sometimes like whispering, and sometimes like a steady chant, and occasionally rising to a tone that set children to crying in their sleep. Isabel responded to these sounds as if they were instructions. She traced patterns in the dust, copying movements that looked less like the clumsy play of a child and more like rehearsed liturgy. Her drawings, collected by the other children and later found locked in a trunk, were not childish doodles, but tight spirals and loops, diagrams that implied pathways rather than pictures. She drew by candlelight, hour after hour, until the letters she formed looked like the margins of old ledgers. Where other children drew simple homes and animals, she drew enclosures and knots and a shape that repeated like a brand. Neighbors told of strange offerings left at their thresholds: feathers, coins, a lock of hair. Once, a farmer found a small pile of objects at the base of his barn door: dried herbs, a scrap of paper with a name crossed out, and the footprint of a child's hand pressed into the earth, as if trying to hold something down. No one accused Isabel openly at first. Accusing children would have been monstrous. Yet the town's unease gathered like a storm front. the more the hollow looked away from Magdalene's house, as if its windows were the hollow's shame. The more the house's quiet acts seemed to seep outward. At night, some swore they saw figures moving in formation through the yard. Not people as neighbors would recognize them, but silhouettes that suggested ritual. Stones arranged in a circle, a bowl emptied of something dark. Ash scrawled in runes that were not churchly but older, like something the mountain itself half remembered. The hollow's priest crossed himself and refused to speak about these things in public, because the word, once spoken, seemed to force its own shape upon reality. Isabel's behavior escalated with a meticulous, almost mathematical clarity. She began to sleep less when she did sleep. She spoke of a thread and of weaving, and of a pattern that must not be broken. Magdalene, meanwhile, was steady as the root of a tree, a presence that anchored and pushed with equal force. She taught Isabel how to keep ledgers, to note dates, and to draw lines that looped back. What looked like superstition to outsiders was a meticulous practice to them, an attempt to arrange ancestry like a loom, to control the weave of heredity without outsiders' interference. The hollow had never been striking. Its crimes, such as they were patient. But patience is a particular cruelty when it is wielded by someone who believes history can be sharpened and redirected. And so the hollow, which had always preferred things to go slowly, found itself on the edge of abrupt collapse. Rumors swelled into confession when the ledger in Magdalene's hand was uncovered by chance. It was an old thing, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, bound with twine and dotted with stains that neither time nor clean water could erase. The pages were not numbered as other ledgers were. They contained lists, diagrams, and marginal notes that suggested calculation. Where ordinary family records note births, deaths, and marriages, Magdalene's pages tracked patterns, the repetition of certain traits, the reappearance of a particular tilt of the jaw, the slow accumulation of certain physical markers. On one page she had drawn a circular chart and placed names at intervals like hours upon a clock. The lines between them pulled taut, as if to show where force was concentrated. There are ways of telling a secret that make it real. Ink is one of them. Once a thing is written and kept, it settles into the world as if it had always been there. The hollow had always concealed more than it revealed. But this ledger was a brazier in the dark. A farmer's wife found it by stepping on the edge of a floorboard that gave, and in the scratch of that betrayal, the ledger slid into the light. The discovery set people to reading it aloud, and when they did, the pattern of their voices mirrored the pattern on the page looping, surprised, and then suddenly taut with fear. What the ledger did not show was the warmth of intent, which is more dangerous than paper. It did not show the way Magdalene spoke to Isabel at odd hours, guiding her hands to shape names on paper, whispering that some names must be kept close as though they were seeds. It did not show her patience, which included the true cruelty of planning across generations, of thinking not in years, but in lineages. The ledger was only the surface. The surface is the thing neighbors could hold and pass around and feel like safety because it was finite. But the ledger implied practices, arrangements, marriages, pairings that had been encouraged, whispers placed in young ears, alliances fostered with the insistence of weather. Those who read the ledger realized the hollow had not merely narrowed its gene pool by accident. Someone had been tending it like a gardener tends an herb patch. Names were guided together, couplings arranged by conversation and nudges, and the patient rearrangement of households. People recalled invitations that seemed casual at the time, or discouraged visits that seemed convenient. The ledger's diagrams were not merely a record, they were a plan. Confrontation is a slow thing when people fear becoming monsters by action. At first there were questions posed in the parish hall, asked in the low tones of men who had been taught to keep their hands clean while their feet were filthy. Then there were letters written with hands that shook. Then, as the ledger's implications crystallized, the community's voice hardened. They called for Magdalene to answer, for her practices to be exposed to the clear light of law and scripture. The men came to her house wearing the moral armor of outrage, but they were also wearing something rawer. The terror that they had been unknowingly complicit in a pattern that they had enabled by their silence. Magdalene did not deny the records. She did not piously repent. She answered only with an odd serenity, like one who has read the last page of a book and knows the ending cannot be rewritten. She spoke of duty. She spoke of preservation. She spoke of an old wound that she had set out to heal. The Hollow's response unfolded with a ritual all its own, a tribunal of neighbors, notables, and those who could claim bloodlines, as if lineage were itself a mandate to judge. The church supplied a pew and an anxious sermon, and though the sermon sought to bind what had been unraveled with scripture, scripture and ledger do not speak the same language. The tribunal stammered with the uncertainty of people who had lived by a mission, and now found that a mission had become its own kind of act. They were tired and fierce, like winter suddenly decided it would not only chill but break as well. Magdalene attended that gathering as though to watch a play in which she already knew the lines. Her slow, even breathing was a metronome against the hurried words of accusation. She did not beg, she listened. She had that calm that comes from someone who has always lived with consequence. The townsfolk pressed for removal of her rights, for exile, for the burning of the ledger. Some, driven by a more primitive fear, wanted the ledger destroyed so the names and diagrams could not be used as maps for future concealments. Others wanted it preserved as evidence against the hollowness itself. What mattered less to them in those moments was the figure of Isabel, who watched the proceedings with a look like a thing trying to understand the reasons for a weather pattern. Isabel hardly spoke. She made no defense. She did not plead. She sat as if witnessing the logical conclusion of a lesson already learned. The Hollow's fury, when it came, was not theatrical. It was an economy of violence, lights put out, small goods confiscated, the ledger snatched and carried through the streets like a curse. They were able to perform the outer gestures of justice without recognizing that justice might require more than spectacle. Yet the Hollow's attempt to cure itself through expulsion and destruction had the bluntness of a hand trying to scrape away a stain from old cloth. The fire that took Magdalene's barn, whether accident or the result of unseen hands, ate quickly, licking at memories as well as timbers. People told themselves that the flames were proof they were right, that the sacred had vindicated the profane. But when a house burns, it does not only destroy the guilty, it erases the nuanced histories tucked there, the notebooks that contained half-formed remorse, the objects that were evidences of human frailty rather than deliberate evil. Fire is reductive. It makes the world easier to navigate for a while, but it also carves a scar into the landscape that other fears can find and bind to. After the barn and the weeks of quietly furious meetings, the town tried to stitch itself back together. Farms resumed their slow demands. Children returned to their easy cruelties. But beneath the ordinary calendar, the Hollow began to feel like a place that had been exsanguinated of its illusions. Men who had once been willing to look away now saw how their acts of silence had been a kind of tending. They began to understand that excision alone does not reach the precise tendrils of a practice that was woven into the daily fabric of life. And then, late in the year when the geese flew low and the air tasted metallic, something else arrived at the edges of their reasoning. The knowledge that answers they had believed complete were incomplete. Someone had taken copies of pages from the ledger before it was burned. The copies were small things, hidden in a shoe or sewn into a hem, but copies have a persistence that their creators do not always anticipate. A page, in the hands of a certain kind of reader, can continue instruction long after the hand that wrote it is still. Decades have a way of softening memory while sharpening consequences. By the time a researcher arrived in the region in the 1980s, the hollow's tale had already been reduced to varying degrees of rumor and moralistic footnote. That researcher, a woman who kept temperature records and who asked questions in a way that made archivists trust her, found references to Magdalene and to a series of inexplicable births. Her notebooks filled with measurements and perplexed annotations. She was trained not to jump to myth, but to follow documentary traces wherever they led. In the county archives, she found marginalia, the notes of a midwife, the line items of a family ledger, the offhand comment of a minister. Her hands trembled when she came across a photograph slipped into a parish ledger, a group portrait in which the eyes of one child seemed older than the rest. Photographs are betrayals designed by light. They demand recognition, even when you would rather not be seen. The researcher became aware that an entire chain of small decisions had combined into the hollow's certain fate. She interviewed descendants, now living in other counties, who offered half memories and the defensive prattle of people who had learned to compartmentalize shame. She listened to tapes, grainy cassette recordings made by local historians, in which elders spoke in hushed tones about rituals and offerings, about a woman who kept charts like an astronomer keeps maps of the sky. They had names for things they no longer dared to do. In her notes, the researcher wrote that the hollow's pathology was not simply genetic, it was cultural, procedural, deliberate. What she found most compelling and most dangerous were the fragments of Magdalene's practice that had escaped destruction. In an attic trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and moth-eaten linen, she found a small box containing lists. The lists were methodical. They recorded pairings, births, the appearance of certain traits, and their prevalence over time. There were annotations in the margins in a handwriting that grew shakier as it proceeded, as if the writer's conviction had increased even as her body failed. There were ritual prescriptions, too. Times for certain names to be spoken, gestures to make before a birth, offerings of food to be placed in particular places. The researcher also found a voice recorder, an old cassette with spooling tape inside. On it, Magdalene's voice could be heard, whispering not confessions, but lectures. She spoke of preservation with a patience that did not sound like cruelty so much as theory put into practice. She spoke of a pattern she intended to make permanent, a fabric of kinship woven so tightly that nothing of the outside world could pass through it. The tape was the sound of someone explaining an inevitability, and, in its coolness, it was more chilling than any cry of madness. What the researcher could not measure, because some things resist measurement, was the effect of belief on bodies. She could plot occurrences, map names, and even trace the movement of a particular family across decades. She could not chart the moment when devotion becomes dogma, nor the threshold at which calculation becomes fanaticism. She recorded, however, testimonies of the living who had known Isobelt. A farmer who remembered her walking in patterns around stone piles. A woman who had been a child when she witnessed a midnight procession, led by a woman with a slow step and patient eyes. These were not theatrical images. They were domestic, small, and persistent, the more dangerous kind. The researchers' publications did not make the town a museum of its shame. They did, however, bring scholars and skeptical visitors who wanted to see the place where rumor met ledger. The hollow, in time, accommodated them the way a body accommodates a scar with a stoic tenderness. There were local guides who would point out Magdalene's house, foundation sunk, windows like dark ledgers, and there were those who spoke of the graves where names loop back, as if the script was a knot of rope. Tourists came and left, their interest often clinical. They pointed their cameras and filed the images away as curiosities. But the hollow's consequences did not remain contained like museum pieces. They traveled in quieter ways. Families who had once practiced the old arrangements found their lines thinned, not only in the physical sense, but in the sense of social possibility. The hollow's children carried a distrust of outsiders like a second skin. Marriages were more difficult to arrange. Some families moved away entirely, carrying with them a carefully edited version of their past. Yet the ledger's instructions, or at least fragments of its logic, had lodged in cultural bone. They fired a certain pattern of secrecy that would recur in new places. One of the more troubling discoveries came when the researcher followed a line to a neighboring county and found a small society that kept similar ledgers. Though less complete, it suggested the hollow's methods had spread, or perhaps it suggested a human tendency to try to control lineage under pressure. Where resources are scarce and the world threatens, people sometimes turn to patterns to make sense of their survival. Patterns can become tyrannies. To preserve blood, to keep a name concentrated, is to decide that some lives are more worthy of continuation than others. This decision, once made, subtly reshapes communities. Isabel's fate, for those interested in the ledger's story, had a quiet end. She married, in a manner that was neither entirely her choice nor entirely not, to a man from a neighboring place. She lived and aged in ways that made the hollow feel less theatrical and more tragic. She kept lists of her own. The things that once seemed so uncanny gradually receded into the dull ache of memory. Yet artifacts linger. A smear of ash on a threshold, a child's box with a lid that will not stay closed, the faint odor of herbs in an unused pantry. These are the residues of practices that once demanded belief. The hollow's final lesson, which the researcher wrote about without flourish, was this: secrecy is a slow replicator. It does not need to be taught loudly. It teaches itself by repetition, by the modest acts of neighbors who look away, by the small compromises of everyday life. The ledger, once burned, leaves a pattern in the soil that seeds itself in other, humbler places. What we are left with at the end of such a story is not a clear moral nor a tidy resolution. We are left with a ledger with edges sinned, and with names that refuse to lie still. We are left with houses that settle, and with graves that tilt, and with the quiet conviction that some errors lodge like burrs and are very hard to extract. The hollow continues to exist on maps, though the roads to it have changed, and some houses have been torn down and rebuilt. New families live where old ones did. They wake and bake bread and send children to school. But the hollow's past sits in the corners. in the way certain phrases die in conversation, in manners of speech that survive like fossils, in the reluctance to pronounce certain surnames aloud. There is an image that holds a small box of tokens, hidden under a floorboard, pages of diagrams folded into oilcloth, the careful, almost loving way a woman can plan for the future, like a gardener pruning a tree to shape the harvest she will never see. Magdalene is not a monster threadbare and simple. She is a patient practitioner of a logic that equates order with survival. She believed, ardently, that she was steward of something fragile. That belief, translated into practice, yielded outcomes that were both mundane and monstrous. What we carry away from this is not merely horror, but a quiet unease about how human communities attempt to bend the future toward their own comfort. The practice of secrecy, the rituals that maintain an inner order, these are common across cultures. In some places they are benign. In others, under pressure and fear, they calcify into something destructive. So I will ask the question you will not like, but must consider, whispered as if it were a prayer. If you found that your family's ledger collected more than births, if it contained designs and patterns that directed your life, what would you do? Would you cut the thread or follow it to its end? Would you bury the book or bring it into the light, risking other harms by exposing old practices to the judgment of strangers? Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? There is no neat answer. The Hollow's final legacy is a reminder that the past sits like sediment. It shapes the ground beneath our feet long after the structures built upon it are gone. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The question remains open, and it lodges like a stone in the throat. Who decides which lines are to be kept and which are to be cut?